Hello there. How's everybody doing? All right. I know video is not the perfect way to do class, but thank you for hanging in there this week and watching the video. Everybody say thank you to Miss Stacy for being our host today. All right. As everybody's coming in, we usually have these words up on the PowerPoint for you. These are your study guide words for chapter 6. If you want to go ahead and get those added to your list. So Unit 2 test will be over chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can look in the beginning of your book in the table of contents. It says Unit 2 is 4, 5, 6, and 7. So Miss Stacy can go ahead and pause the video now and let everybody get those copied down before you guys move on. All right. If somebody will open up their Canvas app and take attendance for me, and just tell me who's there and who's not there. You're my biggest class. I can tell you who's missing and who's not. Let's see. There should be 8 kids. We've got Chloe, Addie, John Matthew, Carly Mae, Caitlin, Avery, Dean, and Sawyer. If anybody's absent, shoot me a message. Thank you so much. If nobody is absent, please shoot me a message that says everybody was in attendance. So today, you guys have read chapter 6 over federalism. You have pages 53 and 54. That was homework. Just keep it, please. I will collect those from you next week when I return. Hold on to those. You had 3 videos. Another Schoolhouse Rock. Those are always fun. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with learning the preamble. So Miss Stacy, what we've been doing is memorizing the preamble. I've got it broken up into 4 parts. Today, they are going to memorize up through part 3. It's for extra credit, so it's not required. It is 5 points of extra credit. And if you wouldn't mind grabbing a piece of paper from one of the kids, anybody that stands up and says it, if you'll write down their name and 5 points, if they got it all, that would be great. And then I can get that from you when I get back. Also, Miss Stacy gets to be the judge. So if she decides that you knew half of it and you get 3 points, or if she decides that you only knew 1 line, so you got 1 point, it's up to her, however many points she wants to give out. And let's see, let's start with, let's have the whole class read part 1, part 2, and part 3 3 times, which is what we did last week too. So read it out loud 3 times. Somebody kick it off. Okay, and pause it if you haven't finished that yet. So we can see who wants to go first. Miss Stacy, the next slide is going to be back to where I'm showing you the words again. So whoever wants to go, they just turn their face around where they can't see the screen and recite it. And that way you can see what the words are and you can check them. So you can pause the video, and I hope everybody gives it a shot. It's 5 points or at least a couple of points. Pause the video and see who knows it. All right, finishing up with that. Today is chapter 6 in federalism. We are going to take some notes, and I would like you to take notes because I like to give you a little bit more specifically what's going to be on the test as we go through each chapter, which should help you out a lot. And you always want to mark those things down. I am going to give everybody the points for today's notes, and I'm going to trust that you are all taking notes because it is to your benefit. There are 4 parts to this chapter. You don't have to copy this down. These are just the section headlines. You see them right there in the book. The first one on page 111 is partitions of power. And we're talking about federalism. So here on the screen, the 10th Amendment. By the end of the semester, you're going to hear this so many times. The powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, which means to the national government, and they're not prohibited to the states, then they are reserved for the states. Now, the words delegated and reserved are going to come up on the test. We're going to talk about those in just a second. So federalism, what is federalism? You need to know the definition of federalism, dividing power between levels of government. Okay, federalism, dividing power between levels of government. One more time, federalism, dividing power between levels of government. In the United States, we have two major levels of government. Your brain is thinking and turning and churning. We have the national government, which a lot of people call the federal government, right? We talked about that last week. And we have state governments. So we have two levels of government in the United States. You could also say three. I mean, you could say the local government, but the book is going to go with national and state. Okay. Now, we have what we call limited government, which we talked about last week a little bit. Limited government, we're just preventing tyranny, right? And one of the ways that we limit government is we divide it up. So we give some power to the national government and some powers to the states. Both of our levels of government draw their power from the people. And does anybody remember that bold word or that important word from last week that meant the power is from the people? If you don't remember, that one is also on the test. It's popular sovereignty. That is from chapter 5, popular sovereignty, power from the people. So let's talk about these two powers. Delegated powers, we're at the bottom of page 111. Powers given specifically by the Constitution. It's going to define the limits of the authority of the government because we wanted the founders wanted our government to have a limit of their authority so that we wouldn't have tyranny, absolutism. We wouldn't have an emperor, we wouldn't have a king. Okay? Delegated powers. Powers granted to the government and also limiting its authority. So you have two powers underneath delegated powers. You have enumerated powers and implied powers. Your enumerated powers, which is a big fancy word for it's written. It's written there specifically, okay? Specifically written in the Constitution that the national government has those powers. And then, of course, as you can guess, implied powers, they're not spelled out. They are powers that Congress may make a law about in order to enact an enumerated power. They're derived from enumerated powers, from powers that are specifically stated in the Constitution. Let's see if they're in the glossary. I didn't even look to see how they stated it. Let's check and see. Glossary, enumerated powers, also called the expressed powers, powers specifically granted to the national government by the Constitution. And implied powers, the glossary says, these are powers that are derived from the powers that are granted by the Constitution. So they're derived by the enumerated powers. Okay? The government has those powers just because they are the government. All right, let's take a look. These two powers, enumerated powers, implied powers. How about the power to collect taxes? Shout it out, enumerated or implied? The Constitution in Article 1, Section 8 says that the government has the right to collect taxes, okay? If it's stated in the Constitution that they have the right to, or the power to, collect taxes, then that means that it is enumerated powers. We also have the 16th Amendment, the Income Tax Amendment. So that would be another place in the Constitution. How about Congress passing the minimum wage law that says anyone living within the United States has to make at least $7.25, the minimum wage law? Enumerated or implied? So minimum wage law is going to be our implied power because the Congress has the power to regulate commerce among the several states. That's what we find in the Constitution, regulate commerce among the several states. So they cited the necessary and proper clause. If you remember us talking about that last week, the necessary and proper clause that's in the Constitution Congress cited that clause when they created the law that would be a minimum wage law for the United States. So that would be an implied power, which means they had to create that minimum wage law in order to fulfill the duty of regulating commerce among the several states. You guys read about that in the book, so hopefully it's the second time you're hearing that. Necessary and proper clause. We have a nickname for this one called the elastic clause. Article 1, Section 8, make all the laws which are necessary and proper to carry out and execute the powers that are stated in the Constitution, okay? It does greatly enlarge the government, right? It gives them more power. So some people do not like the elastic clause. And in fact, some people would make fun of it or give it nicknames. Necessary and proper doesn't exactly mean whatever you want, right? The framers knew that in the limited amount of time that they had to write the Constitution, that they might not be able to anticipate every kind of power that Congress would need. That's what this cartoon is saying. So they included what's become known as the elastic clause. All right. Let's talk about reserved powers. And those are the powers that are reserved to the states, okay? Delegated powers, make sure you have this in your notes. Delegated powers, national government, okay? Delegated powers for the national government. Reserved powers is referencing reserved powers that are reserved for the states. Powers reserved for the states. And that comes in the 10th Amendment. We're going to mention it one more time, right? So why did the Federalists include the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights? We talked about it last week. They wanted to give the states more freedom to exercise their own authority because, you guys told me this last week, the Anti-Federalists said that the Constitution did not give enough power or personal freedoms to the states and the people. So that's why the 10th Amendment was in there. Reserved powers, powers for the states. Here's an example, just an example of one. The states have their right to pass their own legislation. One of them is they get to set their own speed limits. I think we talked about this last week as well. Yeah, them setting their own speed limits. We talked about marriage laws. That's what we talked about, marriage laws. Okay, what about this one? Crossing state lines in order to buy fireworks. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, for one thing, in some states, they're not even legal. In some states where there might be fire hazards and they deal with wildfires, they're not going to allow fireworks to be sold anywhere in that state. People might cross state lines to buy them and bring them back, okay? There's other things like sales taxes. Some people may cross state lines to buy a car because the sales tax, actually cars, I don't think would count, but there are other things that you can cross state lines to buy if you don't live too far because the sales taxes might be cheaper in another state. Okay. This is on the test. Where do the local governments get their power? So we're switching from state governments, they have the reserved powers, to local governments. What do you think? Anybody want to answer that one? Their purpose is just to implement state laws. So where do they get their power from? The state. Local government, they implement state laws. That's their job. All right. When the founders wrote the Constitution, state pride was a really big deal. In the book, it cites the 17th Amendment as kind of a timekeeper around that time that the 17th Amendment was passed. Before that time, state pride was very important. People identified with their state. When the founders wrote the Constitution, people identified with their state more than they did their nation. That's different now. Back then, it took a long time to travel from state to state. Your family didn't move to another state very often. Everyone lived close by. So you were very proud of your state. but that's not the same now. Many of us travel to different states often. We may have relatives in multiple states, so we identify more as Americans sometimes than we do as Mississippians. A lot of times I have the football helmets up here in the book. It talks about how many people only identify with their state based on their football team or based on their mailing address. So, okay. Let's move on to section 2, developments in federalism. On page 114, we've got this picture on 116 about the cakes. Well, dual federalism is what the founders had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. Dual federalism, which means that there were separate powers. Some powers were given to the national government, and the other powers were reserved for the states, correct? But this marble cake that you see on the right, the book is trying to show you, this is more like what our government is like now. This would be considered cooperative federalism. Instead of dual federalism on the left, cooperative federalism on the right. This is what we have now. In fact, we're going to talk about categorical grants and grants in aid here in just a minute. And because the national government shares a lot of its revenue with the state governments, then they end up having a say in what the state governments do and don't do because they are giving them money. Okay. Let's look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You need to know that Franklin Roosevelt is connected with the New Deal. You need to know the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt are connected. So 1913, the 16th Amendment gets passed, and the 16th Amendment is the Income Tax Amendment. And when the national government starts collecting income taxes from all of its people, there is a huge increase in money going into the national government, okay? A huge amount of money, a huge influx into the national government. So then we moving along, and we move into the 1930s. In the 1930s, who knows what happened? Take a second, somebody tell me what happened in the 1930s. Did somebody say Great Depression? Okay, so Roosevelt takes office at the beginning of the Great Depression. The day after his inaugural address, as he took the office, he declared a 4-day bank holiday. He was stopping people from withdrawing their money from shaky banks that were about to close down, and he passes an Emergency Banking Act. He's trying to get people to trust the banks again. By the end of that month, many of the banks were able to reopen. He also begins this program called the New Deal. The New Deal is all about money going from the federal government or the national government into the states. Okay, we're going to start seeing a lot of money moving from the national government into the states for state level programs. This is where we see the change from dual federalism over to cooperative federalism. Okay, so these three ideas are all connected. We've got Franklin Roosevelt, who has the New Deal programs, and we see a change of dual federalism where state power and national power is separate to where they start mingling because the national government is giving a lot of money to the states. A change in government. Next up, financing federalism. You guys read about these. There's 3 different kinds of grants. We started out with categorical grants where the national government is giving money to the states specifically for a project, a specific purpose, okay? You get a grant, the state gets money so that you can build this park. The state gets money so that you can. National government just gave a lot of money to Jackson. Anybody know what Jackson is supposed to do with the water? With the money. It is supposed to go into the water system. Yes. It is slated specifically for that, and it is money from the national government to the state government. Then we have what are called block grants in the book, and block grants are really general. They're much simpler. There's a lot of flexibility. So if you had a block grant for urban renewal, you could use that money to improve education because that would renew an urban area. You could put it into housing. You could give companies business loans if they were going to settle in that urban area that you were trying to renew. So block grants, much simpler, much more flexible, bigger ideas. And then we're going to stop on this revenue sharing for a little bit and talk a little bit about revenue sharing. This is the idea that the national government is going to give money to the states, okay? Revenue sharing. States are going to receive money based on different categories or different things. One of the things we talked about last week was the school system and how they got money based on attendance. So they want those kiddos to be in their seats because the federal government gives out per student monies per student. This map is kind of hard to see, but I've got another one that's coming up in a minute that's much, much better. The darker red color are states that are receiving more money from the national government. The lighter colors are states that are receiving less money from the national government. Now we see Louisiana, Mississippi are receiving quite a bit. Why is there a lot of money going to New Mexico and Arizona? Does anybody know? You see New Mexico and Arizona are dark red as well. Anybody got an answer for that? Okay, this would be Indian reservations. I don't know if anybody knew that or not. Indian reservations that are out there. So they're getting quite a bit of money there for that. Here's a little chart. Federal aid to state and local governments. It's just, this is an older chart, only goes up through 2010, but you can see the increase over time between 1998 and 2010, which is only 12 years. Look at the increase there in money that is going out to state and local governments. It's just an interesting little chart. Okay, pull out your workbook and take a look at pages 51 and 52. I'm hoping you guys have time right now to work on this a little bit. This is all about revenue sharing. There's going to be some information on 51 about Nixon and about Reagan and revenue sharing. I want you to pair up, be brave, pair up with somebody that's not sitting right next to you. Pair up with somebody other than your best friend. Pair up and answer these questions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on page 52. Just answer as many as you can. You may not complete it. Just answer as many as you can before, let's say, I only have like a couple of slides left. Let's say 1:45, okay? Yes, let's say 1:45, okay? Whoops, I clicked on the wrong one, didn't I? 51 and 52, Miss Stacy will pause the video. I want you guys to work on that. Okay, I've got just a couple of slides on the problems of federalism. Nothing too big here, okay, guys? Nothing big at all. We've got maintaining distinctions between state and national governments, and that is because we have so much money coming in from the national government that they have a lot of say in what's going on here. They're going to have a lot of requirements. When they give Jackson money to fix the sewer system, there's going to be somebody coming to check up on it and see how it's going. And they'll probably have a lot of requirements, and there'll probably be a lot of red tape. Okay, that's them having a say in state-run business because they're giving us money. So distinctions between those two levels of government. Another problem, they become involved in state issues and state policies. So let's just look at education again. education is a state power. Okay, it is one of the powers that is not stated to the federal government in the Constitution. Therefore, because of the 10th Amendment, it falls to the states. Education, the building of schools, even the requirement of students to be in class. So every state has a law that says children need to be in school, children have to be educated. All of that is set up by the states. But education becomes a local issue, a state issue, and a national issue because the federal government gives money to the schools. So if they're requiring proof of attendance to give money to those local schools, then those local schools they've gone out and hired attendance officers. Why? Because they have somebody going and knocking on doors and saying, Johnny's not in school, get Johnny to school, get Johnny to school. Why? Because they want the federal money. So now your local schools are spending money on something that they may not have if it wasn't for the federal dollars coming in. The important part here, the bottom line is, you need to know some issues like education become mixed up. They become a state issue and a national issue, okay? All right. Another problem is we have a growing national debt because the federal government is spending so much money. We don't want the federal government to spend a ton of money, but I don't want my neighbor to lose his job either. If he works in Jackson at the federal building, or if he works for the water company and the water company is given a grant and they're given a lot of money to fix the pipes, well, they may hire him to do that work. And if they're not giving the federal money, then he may lose his job. There are a lot of people in the state that rely on federal funds to pay their paychecks. So it's give and take, right? We do have a growing national debt, and that is a problem. And then we have states that end up competing for funding, and that does happen as well. So we're talking about that last slide. Here's a better map that you can see easier. Federal spending in each state, okay? If the state is blue, they are getting more money from the national government than the people are paying in taxes. If the state is red, that state is at a revenue loss when it pertaining to taxes. So their state is receiving less money from the federal government in aid than their people are paying in federal taxes. Okay, I'm going to skip through this slide because you guys are all going to get the points for taking notes today. And we're going to go on, don't pack up, hang on and make sure you listen, don't pack up. Next week, you're reading chapter 7, page 58 and 59 in your workbook, okay? Listen carefully, 58 and 59 in your workbook. This assignment goes for 3 pages in your workbook. It is actually 57, 58, 59, and 60. Sorry, it's 4 pages. We're not doing all 4 pages. You're only covering the 3 branches of government. You're covering the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And this is the important part. It is for your state legislature and your state executive branch and your state judicial branch. So when it asks you how many justices sit on the Supreme Court, it is referring to your state Supreme Court, not the national Supreme Court. So keep your focus on the state. The top of page 59 is just the last 2 questions for 58. So you're basically just completing 58. It just so happens that it finishes up on the next page. If you have questions, send me a message about that. You have a couple of videos. Your Unit 2 exam will be online in a couple of weeks. You've been getting your study guide words at the beginning of each week. So start studying your notes. If you're going to build a Quizlet, if you're going to make flashcards, whatever it is, start building that for yourself. You will not be getting a study guide from me. Your study guide is the words that you take down at the beginning of each week, and then your notes, because in the notes, I tell you what will be on the test. So you're building your study guide as you go. It will be online, and you will have only an open window of like 3 days, I think, to complete it. Okay, so we're trying to build some responsibility and get you ready for college. Thanks for watching the video today, guys. I know it's not perfect. I will be back in class with you next week. And thank you so much to Miss Stacy for hosting. Bye, guys.